Hi, it's Sam. In this video, I'm going to be sharing with you all the information that I've learned over the years using Max for Live that I think is difficult to find and is very useful for trying to put together a effective Max for Live device. So if you want to follow along, you can open up Ableton, go to the Max for Live tab, and then click on any of the types of Max devices, audio effect or instrument and MIDI effect, then you could follow along. Just for your information, these differences don't matter for this, you can pick any of them, is that Max audio effects take in audio and send out audio. Max instruments have MIDI as input and audio for output, and Max MIDI effects have MIDI for input and MIDI for output. So I'm going to click on the edit button here on the device title bar to open up this patch. And let's take a look at its contents. It's in presentation mode, so I'll go back to the editing mode. Let's start with talking about namespace. So you can have collections of data that you share across different instances of the same device. So if you have a col, a table, or a buffer, and they share a name, then they are going to share data either in the same a different instance of the same device or a different device that has the same name for that type of data collection. So if you want to avoid sharing data across devices, then you can add 3 dashes before the name of that object. So sends and receives, for example, I've added 3 dashes here. So if I opened up another instance of this device, it wouldn't send these values to that other instance of the device. Now, storage is another important aspect of your Max for Live device, and we're going to start off by looking at the inspector of this live dial. And the first option you have for storage is to set an initial enable. So if initial enable is on under parameter, and I apologize in advance, I don't think there's a way of making this text larger, so it might be best to follow along here. Under parameter, there's initial enable. And when that's turned on, that will allow there to be an initial value when you open up the device for the first time. You'll see it says, this parameter will be set to initial value as specified in the initial value column when the pattr or device is loaded. So when you select some data value here, like, 24, I can turn it off, then on again, it'll set that as the initial value. This then can go a little bit further by setting the parameter visibility for this object. So there are 3 options: automated and stored, stored only, or hidden. So on stored only, you can't automate, but it will store the value that you've set for that dial. So if I set it to 127 and I close my live set and open it again, it will still be at 127. But if I make it hidden, it won't store the value, and you also can't automate it. But this also means that it won't send out the value at the device's instantiation. So if I had a value like 76 that then sets the value for other parts of my device, when I open up this device, it won't send out that value. So I'd need to use like a load bang or a load mess or some other technique to make sure that that value is sent out. So keep that in mind if that's the way that your device functions. If you go to View and then Parameters, you can view all of the parameters in your device, which is useful. It'll give you some information about it, and if you click on it, it'll show you where in your device that object is. If you have some non-live objects, like this multi-slider, that you want to be able to use similar to a live object, then you'll have to turn parameter mode enable on. That'll then give you the options that I just looked at. So now I can have initial enable and have initial values, But I also needed to change something for the multi-slider. I had to change it to blob for the data type, because this is a list of data points. If it's on something like float, it'll only send out the first value of the slider, the first slider. Now let's look at the visuals, and I'm going to pull down this dial. So let's go into the inspector again, and I've made this visible to mapping. And what that means is that if I want to control this dial using my MIDI keyboard or using my computer keyboard, then I can be able to do that. So you might want that on, you might want that off. You can make that decision in the inspector here. You can also change some of the visual aspects of the dial. So under short name, this is it's going to show up for the user interface. So I just wrote down short name. That's what shows up in the text here. There's also the long name, which is used for automation and modulation in Ableton. So when you go to those menus, that's what's going to show up as the name. And this is also what's used as the info view title if you don't fill out the info view title field in the inspector. And info view is right over here, this box. Here's the title. This one is just info view because I'm looking at info view, and then here's the text. And you can set the text for info view for this object by going to the info view text field. You can also click on edit here, and it'll give you a little pop-up where you can more easily write something longer. And the info view title is right below that if you want to make that separate from the long name. And the long name is different from the short name in that it has to be unique for that pattr level. So if you have sub-pattrs, you can have the same name as something that's in the main patch. But in one patch level, you can't use the same long name for two different objects. Another feature that I just want you to know about, but you might not necessarily use, is hint. So when I lock the patch and hover over the dial, you'll see that there's hint shows up in this yellow text box, and I just wrote hint in there, so it just says hint. And I think this is a little obtrusive. I don't think many devices use this, but if you have a good reason to use it, that's where you can find it. If you want to use presets in your Max for Live device, I would suggest using the pattr system to help you store and recall those. The first thing you can do is add auto pattr object, which automatically includes any objects with the scripting name field filled out in the inspector to the pattr system. So if you go to the inspector and go to scripting name, you can add a scripting name there. You can also link that scripting name to the long name, which is useful. Now, if you need to exclude an object from the pattr system, like you don't want it to be that value to be saved or recalled, then you can use the second outlet from AutoPattr and connect it to whatever objects that you don't want to be included in pattr. We're going to be using pattr storage to save and recall the presets. And I've put the name here as device storage with 3 dashes so that this doesn't conflict with other instances of the same device. And I've also turned parameter enable on so that it works with the Max for Live parameters. And I've also made it so that it auto updates the parameters' initial values when I make any changes to their values. I think that's everything you have to do. Actually, you also need to go into the inspector and turn on initial enable so that it will save and then send out those values whenever you are loading up the device. Then I'm going to also show you something. Okay, yes, I want to double click on pattr storage, and you can see what is being saved in pattr storage right now, which is the dial up here, and also the multi-slider, which is up here, right? So those two are being saved with pattr storage, which is what I want. Now, I'm all going to use the preset object to as a GUI for saving and recalling these presets. And it's really easy to use. If you go into the inspector, you just add the pattr storage name under the preset subheading and the pattr storage field. I'll just put down the name device storage with 3 dashes. And now those are going to be linked together. So when I try to save something here with the preset object, it'll then store it in pattr storage. And then when I recall it, it will recall it from pattr storage as well. Lastly, I'm going to cover the visuals of the device as a whole. Now, the first thing I want to do is go to Arrange and turn Snap to Grid on so that all of the visual elements will snap to the grid. It makes it much easier to have a nice looking device that way. Now we're going to go into the device inspector. So with nothing selected, I'm going to open up the inspector and then click on this diamond here in the center on the top that says Show Pattr Inspector. And now we have options for setting up the device itself. Now the first thing I'm going to look at is the editing field or the editing subheading. And here there is the grid size option. Now if you want to make this smaller, right now it's an 8x8 grid. This is attached to this grid, it's snapping to it. Now if I want to make that smaller, I'll turn this maybe to, 4x4. And I'm also going to turn snap to pixel on. Now if you, on some displays, if you have a position, like say that this live comment is at, like a point, let's see, 0.4 or something like that, that could end up looking blurry on some displays. So snap to pixel makes it so that you're not going to have any partial pixels. You can also take a look at the view subheading. This has the, fixed initial window location. So it's always going to be 00 something 169. So 00 makes sense, but the 169 is the height, which you really can't change in Ableton. It's fixed. But you can change the width based on how wide you need it to be. And if I go to presentation mode, you can see the width here. And I can then change it, like make it, let's see if I change it to 300 or, that's 399, 300. See, it jumps. I can see how large it is. So I'll put it back to 400 again. I also want to make sure that it opens in presentation mode. So that's another option to make sure you select here, and that it snaps to the grid on open. I don't think it saves the snap to grid with the patcher or the device. So turning that on will make it easier when you are trying to rearrange objects. You don't have to keep on making sure that that's turned on every time. I also wanted to point out that there's a difference between a regular max comment and a live.comment, and I would recommend using live.comment. Let's see if you actually need to type it out if you want to use it like that. If you just hit C on your keyboard, you're going to get a regular max comment, even when you're doing max for live patching. The live comment looks more like the text in Ableton, and also it's going to, by default, have the correct dynamic colors that you want for the changing themes and whatnot. So I'd suggest using live.comment instead of the max comment. Lastly, let's go to our patching, go to our presentation mode, and make sure that once everything is kind of set up the way that you want it, if you want to add things to presentation mode, there's like a few options. You can right click on that object and say add or remove presentation. Also go to the object menu here and select add or remove, and there's shortcuts here. And once that's set up the way that you want it, I would suggest, just in case, that you select all the objects and go to Arrange and apply a 1x1 pixel grid to make sure that you don't have any partial like floating point pixels. And then you're going to want to make sure to freeze your device. I'm gonna lock it and then freeze it so that it saves. That's in the bottom here. It saves any assets that need to be that need to go along with the device, like if you have any abstractions or images, whatever you might have. Make sure that those are included by freezing the device. Now we should be able to close the patch, and if we change some of the values here, we'll save this by shift-clicking the first preset box, and then I'll change it again, shift-click, and then it's saving and recalling these just the way I'd like it to. And that about wraps up what I wanted to cover with Max for Live. I hope you found this useful. I know it's a lot of information, but hopefully you can use this as a reference as you're working on your Max devices. Actually, there's one thing I wanted to point out as well that I think is interesting. If you right-click on the device title bar here, you can open the Max window. So if you wanted to be able to monitor something while in Ableton, but not editing your patch, like if you're doing some debugging, then this could be something very useful for you. But if you have any questions, clarifications, or something that you think I left out that you would find helpful, please let me know. Otherwise, until next time, class is dismissed.